right. Well, we can go ahead and get started here. And then as people jump on, we can just kind of leave some notes in the chat. But once again, wanted to thank everyone for being a part of this today. Welcome to Small Biz Essentials. My name is Ben Schultz, and I'm the Client Services Coordinator here at the Iowa Center. Just wanted to make a couple of quick notes here before we started. This session will be recorded, so we can share it with our friends and other clients who could not be here in person today. And also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, don't be shy. Feel free to use the chat feature here. I sent a message there, but as we are going along, feel free to leave questions there. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by Cynthia Miller and Emmanuel Smith from Disability Rights Iowa. We're going to be talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, your small business, and how to build an inclusive environment. So Cynthia is a graduate of the University of Iowa and Drake Law School. She is the legal director of Disability Rights Iowa and provides legal representation and systemic advocacy to individuals with disabilities in the state in areas including special education, community integration, accessibility, and employment law. Emmanuel is a Drake graduate as well, and he has held a lifelong interest in disability and political action to improve the rights of people everywhere. His work at Disability Rights Iowa focuses on barriers to employment, disability discrimination in the workplace, and advocating for effective employment services for people with disabilities. Cynthia and Emmanuel, thank you so much for being here today. We are really excited to learn a little bit more about the ADA and how we can build more inclusive environments for our small businesses. So I will let you two take it away from here.
Great, thanks for having us.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we appreciate the invite. I'm excited to talk about this today. Well, first, I'm just going to share a little bit about who Disability Rights Iowa is, if you're not familiar with us. We are a legal advocacy agency. We provide legal representation to individuals with disabilities throughout the state of Iowa. We represent anyone from birth to death. We have no age limitations, no disability limitations. Our mission statement is to defend and promote the human and legal rights of Iowans with disabilities and or mental illness. We are a nonprofit. We're federally funded through federal grants, but we are not a state agency or a federal agency. We're a separate nonprofit. Under our statutes, we have some unique authority to do some abuse and neglect investigations that makes us a little bit different than any other law firm in this state. And then the other thing that we do is pursue administrative, legal, and other relief on individuals' behalfs. So when we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, that would basically mean that we represent individuals with disabilities who have complaints either against their employer or against state and federal administrators or small businesses like yourselves. Like I said, we represent all types of disabilities and ages, and we don't charge for our services. So just to give you the perspective, Emmanuel and I will be speaking from a what we'll call a plaintiff perspective or an individuals with a disability perspective, because that's who our clients are. All right, today we're going to focus on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Emmanuel and I are going to kind of go back and forth with these slides. So Emmanuel, I'll let you take it over.
Yeah, my computer throws up for 1 second. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, first, thank you all so much for letting us take the time to talk about what the Americans with Disabilities Act, because it really would be impossible for me to overstate the impact that this law has had on my life. Whether it's from my ability to go to college, to make all the lifelong friends that I've made, to have internships, to go to work every day. It's really played an essential role in my ability to live a full and independent life. And without the ADA, I really worry about, what my life would look like. And I would also worry about later in my life, whether I would have the supports I needed to live in the community. So the ADA has been a huge part of my life, and I have been incredibly grateful to have grown up with the protections it offers. And it's important to note that those protections did not spring up overnight, right? There's a whole nother presentation we could give about the advocacy efforts and the grassroots organizing that went into bringing about what is essentially one of the biggest pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed. And it really was designed create a law that opened up American life for people with disabilities in ways that simply had not been possible before. So in areas of employment, in areas of physical access to services and public entities. And so in every area of my life, I use the ADA every single day. And I'm incredibly grateful that it gives me the protections that it does.
So I'm just going to jump in to say the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, as you can see from the previous slide. And then they have done some revised regulations through the years, the last one being in 2011. And Title I of the ADA relates to employment law. And that's where Congress defined the definition of disability a bit broader. And then for our purposes under Title II and Title III, they specify different things with effective communication, place of lodging, service animals, wheelchair, and other mobility devices. So there's been a little bit of tweaking since the initial passing in 1990.
And
there are 5 parts of the ADA.
I'll add one thing real quick, just because it's an important point I always like to make. Sometimes people come to me after these presentations and beforehand even talk about how they're really excited about to tackle ADA issues, and it's become a passion area, and they really want to learn more about accessibility. And they'll sometimes approach it in a way that doesn't really treat it as a legal obligation, right? It's something they're moving towards, something they want to learn about, but it really neglects to realize that these are clear legal standards that have been set down to protect my rights as a person with a disability. So we always want to approach it from that perspective, and that it's not something an act of charity to follow these regulations and rules. It's really a clear obligation that's been set out by the federal government that we're going to go into today.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. There are 5 parts of the ADA. Today, our presentation is focusing on Title III, which applies to public accommodation and commercial facilities. And then Emmanuel's touched on this already, but the goal of the Americans with Disabilities Act was to provide individuals with disabilities equal treatment under the law. It was really to bring that fairness standard into play and kind of eliminate those barriers that were happening. We have a long history in our country of segregating individuals with disabilities. And this is one of those big civil rights laws that really was talking about inclusion and trying to, basically make it a fair play for everybody. So you can see that some of the goals are independence, definitely access to facilities and services, which we're going to focus on today, but also just have a more integrated, welcoming society. Okay, so what does Title III do? What does it mean to any of you who are listening today? Well, Title III prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in any activity that's in a place of a public accommodation, a commercial facility, or any private entity that offers certain examination or educational course certification. So, that doesn't mean much to you until we really drill down into what is a public accommodation. What does that mean? A public accommodation is any private entity that owns, operates, leases a place of public accommodation. And there are 12 categories outlined in the Americans with Disabilities Act statute. They read like places of lodging, establishments that serve food and drink, a sales or a rental establishment, places of recreation, transportation, those type of things. So the examples we've listed out are restaurants, retail stores, hotels, theaters, physician offices, daycare centers, private schools, any private entity providing transportation. So it's a public accommodation is a very broad definition of basically any place operating in a commercial setting. So what are your requirements under the law? As Emmanuel said, this isn't something that an individual with a disability is supposed to have to enforce. This is something that's in the law right now that all small businesses are supposed to be in compliance with. So I know there's a lot of words on the slides. I'll read them out loud, and then we'll kind of drill down into what do these mean with some examples. But a public accommodation must provide goods and services in an integrated setting, Basically, what that means is there cannot be different provision of services for individuals without disabilities compared to individuals with disabilities. It also eliminates unnecessary eligibility standards or rules that would deny an equal opportunity to enjoy those goods and services. In other words, you can't have arbitrary practices or some sort of standard that would eliminate a person from with a disability from enjoying those goods and services. There's an obligation to modify policies, practices, and procedure that would deny equal access. You must furnish auxiliary aids when necessary to ensure effective communication. And you have to remove any barriers if readily achievable. And those, usually we're talking about physical barriers to an establishment, and we've got some slides that we're going to talk about. But basically what I would break down this slide into the three main things that a public accommodation must do under the Americans with Disabilities Act is make sure that you have physical access to your location. You need to also be aware of having to provide reasonable accommodations to an individual with a disability, and also ensure that you're providing effective communication, perhaps to someone who has some hearing issues or maybe is deaf. So it's easier to see what we're talking about if we give you some examples. And I tried to come up with something that's super obvious and then maybe something that's a little more subtle, because the obvious situations aren't always in play. But an obvious example would be if a retail store had a rule to exclude all persons who are deaf, and they just said, you're not allowed in the establishment if you're deaf. That would be a very obvious violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's not necessary for any provision of the services and clearly is discriminatory. Another one that we see that maybe doesn't seem so obvious is we'll occasionally hear that a child, maybe with a developmental disability or someone who's maybe a little bit older, but isn't at that maturity age of other kids of the same age, is told that they're not allowed to be in a public swimming space or a private pool because they use swim diapers. And that is a rule, obviously, that maybe comes out of some safety or some other reason that was created, cleanliness, those type of things. But sometimes those policies will need to be modified in order to accommodate a child with a disability. Now, a subtle form of discrimination would be requiring a driver's license as the only form of identifications for purposes of payment. I use the words paid by check, and then I realized that we're not really paying by check anymore. But even credit cards, sometimes you have to show an ID. That may discriminate against persons who don't have driver's license because they don't drive, but they may have some other form of identification.
Well, and I also want to always remind people to keep in mind the full experience of the business and not just narrow in on a specific element. So for example, if there's a brand new restaurant that is not accessible and I call them up and I want to go and I raise these accessibility issues and they say, well, hey, we'll bring your food right out to the curb for you, right? That's not an equitable experience as a consumer, right? I'm still not being allowed the full experience of actually dining there and being a customer. So we have to make sure that whatever modifications that a business wants to put in place, that they're really creating an equal experience for people whenever possible.
Just to compare things that Title III does not require you to do as a small business is something that would fundamentally alter the nature of the services, or what's an undue burden. Now, these are legal terms of art, but basically, fundamentally alter means that it would be outside of like whatever your service is. So my example here is if someone entered a physician's office who specializes in burn patients, but maybe doesn't handle any sort of broken limbs or PT, orthopedic type stuff, it would not be discriminatory for that physician to then refer them to someone in a different specialty. A person with disability doesn't have a right to come in and say, you have to treat me just because you're a physician, and claim that's discrimination. So that would be a fundamental alteration of that person's services. An undue burden is more what we would call a financial strain. And that is where we would take a look at all of the resources of the business and make a determination if trying to remove a barrier is so costly that it would kind of put the business under, basically. It's not enough to say like, oh, that might be kind of a tough financial burden for a month or two. I mean, it has to be a significant burden on the finances to meet that threshold. So some other examples is not all restaurants maybe have Braille menus. So an accommodation would be to train your waiters or other employees that can come out and read the menu to the individual. And it's also not likely that a retail store is going to have a sign language interpreter on staff to communicate with an individual maybe who is deaf. So you have to look at what is the type of business. If it's retail, it's most likely that you can communicate maybe by pen and paper and be able to get through that transaction. But if you're, let's say, a mortgage company or a physician's office where you are talking about more complicated matters, a lot of detail, communication by pen and paper may not be effective communication, and you may have to think about hiring someone with a sign language interpreter to reach that burden of effective communication.
Well, and Cindy, let me ask you a question that might alleviate a lot of fears that employers have about, the ADA. For example, I'm a person with disability. I went to Adventureland and I see there's a height requirement on the roller coaster, right? Does the ADA mean that the business has to allow me to use a roller coaster, even though I'm of short stature and below that limit?
No, because the height requirements are usually for the health and safety of the individual. So those are appropriate limitations that an amusement park can put on a ride for the health and safety, because if they allow the individual with the disability to be under your scenario accommodated and they ride the ride, so to speak, and get hurt, then now they're looking at a liability lawsuit. So no,
Right.
it's equal treatment. Everybody under 43 inches is not riding. It doesn't have anything to do with the disability.
That's too bad. But, the key takeaway is the ADA is not going to force an employer to do something that's unsafe and put their consumers at risk, provided there's evidence to back up that risk.
Exactly. All right, so one of the biggest topics under Title III for small businesses is this physical access or barrier removal to their facility location. So we're talking about brick and mortar here. Physical barriers to entering and using a facility have to be removed when they are, quote, readily achievable. That just means that it's easily accomplished and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. So some of these examples would be installing a ramp if the only entrance that you have to your facility maybe are stairs, curb cuts at sidewalks. That sidewalks may fall under state territory or city territory, so that would be Title II. But if you personally own a sidewalk within your facility, that will be your responsibility. For restaurants, this is an easy one. Rearrange your tables and chairs and display racks to make sure that there's appropriate access in aisles, what we would call like pathways or areas of travel. Installing grab bars in public toilets. Those are things that would be easily accomplished or carried out without much difficulty or expense. Okay, we pulled these pictures off of the internet, and these are just, they're kind of silly, but they're just trying to get a little conversation going and just to realize some of the issues that we see that we kind of bonk our head and say, this is just such a no-brainer.
Well, and they get a little trickier as they go along. They're a little less subtle here in a bit.
These are pretty obvious, but picture on the left looks to be like a public restroom. We can see 3 stalls in the photo, and the doors to the stalls are clearly at a height that provides absolutely no privacy. And the contractor in this case would just be fired and probably sued, to be honest with you. What I would say about this picture though is beware sometimes of who you're contracting with, because you may be relying on somebody else to fix an accessibility problem. And you're still responsible ultimately for whether it's accessible or not. But just, this is kind of my beware of who you hire slide to make sure that they know what they're doing and that they know what the standards are under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The picture on the right is just a really bad front stoop or set of stairs. They're crumbling, not in good repair. And then there is what is probably a makeshift ramp on the left side. It's really hard to see if that was truly built, you know, for ramp purposes, because there is a railing that would be blocking the access to the door. And plus there is just absolutely no appropriate space for someone like who uses a mobility device to come up that ramp and like safely be on the top step in order to enter that door. So
Well,
like we said, these are silly but obvious.
I know it looks cartoony, but I swear I've called places before and I've said, hey, do you have a ramp? And they'll just say yes without really giving me a good idea of what I'm getting myself into. And, you know, not all ramps are created equal is the point. And that just because something has a sloped surface does not mean it's going to be accessible or meet the legal requirements of what a ramp should look like.
Right. All right. So if you as the business owner say, well, you know, well, I don't think what you're asking me to do is readily achievable, what's the alternative, or what's the solution to that? The alternative is you're basically trying to accommodate the individual in such a way that you're making your goods and services available in some fashion. So for example, providing goods and services at the door or the sidewalk. Now, as Emmanuel said before, if you're some sort of establishment where people want to go out Friday night after work with their coworkers, and there's that one coworker who can't participate because they can't physically get in your establishment, it's kind of got an exclusionary feel. So whether or not, you know, he can get carry out at the door, it's really still gonna destroy that experience for that person. Home delivery. We'll talk a little bit about COVID-19 and some of those issues that have cropped up in some later slides, but you know, we've really all taken advantage of online purchasing and having home delivery as an option during the pandemic. If an individual could be assigned to help retrieve merchandise from an inaccessible rack, sometimes you'll hear about shoppers that will assist an individual in like a grocery store, and they will go around and assist that individual with shopping. And also just relocating your activities to an accessible location. So for example, if someone's renting your space or wants to have a holiday party with your establishment, or you're having a conference somewhere where you're inviting people into your inaccessible location, then you really need to think about where can you move that conference or activity that's more accessible for all.
Well, and I'll say that, you know, if any good can come out of this pandemic, right, if such a thing is possible, I hope it's having us all rethink what's achievable and what's doable and what's manageable. Because it's one of the things that frustrated the disability community, and myself as a person with disability, is for the longest time we were told we can't do deliveries, we can't do remote teleconferencing, we can't, you know, all these different things. And as soon as the pandemic hit, they became standard overnight, right? So I really think, I hope that's an education for all of us about how, when we want to, we can be innovative and we can be accommodating and we can be flexible in our policies and practices to open up our, you know, our communities to everybody.
Okay, these are pictures that I personally took on the next, this slide and the next slide. I just, so nobody panics on the call or on the Zoom here. I took these pictures at big box stores or national chains, so I'm not going to embarrass anybody here. But all right, if we had a poll question, my poll question would be, what is wrong with this picture? Do you see anything that stands out to you? That for Emmanuel and I, it's very obvious, but to others, it might not be so obvious. I will tell you that I am standing, this is a 2-stall bathroom. The sink and other amenities are outside of the stall. This is the accessible stall. There is a grab bar on the back wall, and there's also a grab bar above the toilet paper holder that's on the left side of the picture. What may not be obvious to you is we see people putting things into the accessible stall that actually creates a barrier. So here, my complaint is we've got a very large garbage can in the corner. While that's very nice, and I think that the purpose of it is just, convenience for the consumer, but it actually takes away that space that an individual who's using a mobility device or a wheelchair needs to have a turn radius, and it's kind of blocking up the space.
Right. It takes an accessible space and makes it inaccessible, which is uniquely frustrating for me.
Okay, the picture on the left is a picture of an aisle that gets extended out with some springtime products. You've got some grills, outdoor grills that are lined up on the right side. You can see the tiki torches on the left side, and you see that the aisle is still appropriately wide for shopping carts, etc. But as you get further down the aisle, we just start to have boxes and things that are cluttering up the aisle. And the point of this picture is just to show you had an accessible pathway that was wide enough for shopping carts, wheelchairs, mothers with strollers, etc. And then we put products in it that then take away that accessible space. So beware of those packaging materials and things like that, and make sure that they're temporary if you're unpacking, but if they're stationary, get those moved.
Well, and at conferences, I've talked with architects who focus on ADA issues, and they'll design a perfectly accessible space. And then the business owner will come back to them later and say, hey, we've gotten all these complaints about inaccessibility at our store. What the heck's going on? And they'll have put all this stuff in the way and taken this really well, meticulously designed accessible space and made it completely impassable for people. So really be aware of what you're adding to a space and how your renovations and changes are going to impact the accessibility features that have been set up.
Mm-hmm. And that's perfect for the picture on the right side. A lovely roller case of all the fruits and vegetables and flowers that we all want to plant this spring. But what you can't see is it's right smack in the middle of a north-south aisle and also an east-west aisle. I was tempted to just shove this thing down one of the aisles just to get it out of the way, but I thought it was more appropriate just to take a photo and share it with all of you today. Like Emmanuel said, a very accessible space, nice wide aisles are now blocked by a feature that is temporary. Okay, in contrast to maybe an existing building where you're maybe going to have a little more trouble trying to understand how do you make that building accessible, especially if you're leasing the space. Anything that is new construction, or if you undertake alterations to an existing facility, I just want you all to think the Americans with Disabilities Act immediately attaches to that, meaning new constructions must be accessible. Any alterations must be accessible to the maximum extent feasible. There is a technical guide that goes along with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The latest standard that I'm aware of is the 2010 standards. These are very specific, I don't want to call them regulations. They're almost specs, so to speak, like they're pictures of diameters and turning radiuses, and they tell you what a slope of a ramp needs to be, those type of things. It's very, very, very specific. So make sure that you're in touch with someone who understands those regulations. And, one of the things that I hate to hear from someone, and I know this happened to the Iowa State Fair back when we were working with them on accessible spaces, is they built a new facility, a new restroom facility, and trusted that architect to do it right. And then found out later that they actually didn't make it as accessible as the standards required. So that was really upsetting to them, especially when you're relying on an architect or someone to know these standards. Okay, Manuel, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, when I give a presentation to master's degree students, or they're going to be work in sociology, they want to understand accessibility. I'll kind of describe this kind of blinder syndrome that people can have sometimes when they're making accessible features, in that they'll focus on making individual elements accessible, but they won't use the common sense of thinking about what is the full process somebody with disability is going to have to use in order to access our space, right? So, for example, if I'm pulling into this space with an accessible van and I'm unloading, in order to use that curb cut, assuming it's kind of hard to see, but assuming that's an accessible curb cut, I would have to go directly into the street in order to do that, right? So we might have an accessible space and we might have an accessible cut, but there needs to be a path in order for me to use those features safely. And so when you're trying to understand whether something is accessible or not, it's not just about the individual features. It's about what is the full experience of somebody with disabilities trying to use this space going to look like, right? And don't focus as much on individual elements as the whole picture of what potential barriers might pop up, because nobody wants to have to go in the middle of the street, just to get up on the sidewalk. And it's something kind of similar here, that the ramp itself I'm sorry, I should describe this. So you have a subway, and we have an awning and a ramp with some nice handrails, and then kind of a flat surface at the top of the ramp, which on its own all looks pretty nice. The problem is that if the door opens out, all of a sudden there's not a surface for people with mobility devices to be on to safely open the door and not like back off the steps, right? Or have to back down the ramp. There's not enough space for people to operate. So you really want to give people the space they need in order to access your property and make sure that, depending on what kind of door you have, that you're not going to be obstructing things in a way that's going to be inaccessible. And then this is something kind of similar. It's a person in a push wheelchair approaching a door on kind of a gentle incline with a push button, right? And the issue with that is, in order to push the push button, they're gonna have to take their hands off the push chair. And I've had this happen to me as well. If you have to navigate with the door and fiddle with the door, right? You're letting go of your wheels, and then slowly but surely you could be sliding down that incline, right? So you need to give people at the top of the ramp a small flat surface, or ADA compliant surface. You can look up the dimensions in the guides that Cindy's mentioned, that give people the space they need to operate and to push buttons, to pull open the doors, to do whatever they need to do in order to safely get inside the space. Because doing any of that kind of stuff on an incline is hard for anybody, whether in a mobility device or whether they're just using the ramp as an ease of access. That can get really tricky really fast. And nobody wants to go sliding down a ramp when they're trying to get in the library. And this one is another huge pet peeve of mine, where we're in another bathroom. And this particular bathroom, it has really nice, fantastic grab rails. They look great. I really wish I could be able to use them. But unfortunately, they're far on the left side of the wall, and with a huge gap between where the actual toilet is and where the handrails are, right? So they're completely useless for really anybody who wants to use that restroom and might benefit from handrails. So unfortunately, a lot of times people will just stick features on to different places, trying to make them more accessible, but not really using common sense of how is somebody going to use this assistive device, right? So we want to make sure that common sense is always at the forefront of whatever we're doing to make a place accessible. And when in doubt, there are plenty of rules to let you know exactly where handrails need to be and exactly how they need to be situated in order to be accessible to people.
Yeah, I would just add, just from a quick eyeballing of this picture, I can already tell that the toilet paper roll dispenser is also too high to be accessible.
Yep, and that is something nobody wants to have to deal with. So these two next pictures are a little bit similar in that they both have small obstructions underneath stairwells and staircases, right? That kind of could be a potential path. People could go under the stairs or next to the stairs, but have things just kind of sticking out in the middle where people could easily run into them. And the concern is always if somebody, for example, has a visual disability, right? And they have, if they're moving along and even anywhere close to a fair clip, right? And something just comes out in the middle of a pathway, they're not necessarily going to have the time they need in order to stop safely, right? Or to navigate around the object. So really, it's just a lack of foresight and a lack of design, creating these unnecessary obstructions that obviously, create barriers for people with disabilities, but a lot of these inaccessible features, they create inconveniences for everybody, not just folks with disabilities. So it's the lack of universal design that I think really could benefit everybody by making sure that we have a clear, unobstructed paths for people to travel around the space. And then this one is yet another pet peeve. These pictures always get me riled up because I remember like individual examples in my own life where I've had to navigate spaces like these. But in this one, it looks like it's in a hotel or an apartment where they have this really nice sink, but they've placed a mini fridge underneath the sink, right? Which on its face seems like a really nice, economical use of the space. But the reality is that now all of a sudden I can't pull up underneath the sink in order to use it, right? Because if I want to use the sink, I can't stand flush against it. I have to pull in, and I have a foot plate, I have my legs, my wheelchair needs a place to go. And all of a sudden I can't use that sink because something has been put underneath it, right? So it's taking what could have been a really nice accessible feature and making it inaccessible. Great impulse, economic use of the space, right? But all of a sudden you're precluding a certain kind of customer from being able to use the utilities. And that's really, really frustrating.
Okay, we're going to move on to another category that is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act that public accommodations likely have to deal with, and that's service animals. And that is where you're going to encounter an individual with this disability entering your establishment, likely with some sort of animal, and then you have to, either deal with the animal maybe who's out of control, or you usually what we hear is we have a no pet policy or a no animal in the store policy for safety purposes. Well, the Americans with Disabilities Act states that a service animal is only a dog, will be recognized as a service animal, and there is a separate provision for miniature horses. I personally have not seen a miniature horse here in Iowa being used, or I haven't advocated for anyone with a miniature horse, but those are the only two animals under the federal law that can be recognized as a service animal.
Yeah, I meant to talk to you about that, Cindy. When I return to the office, I'm definitely going to have to bring a miniature horse.
Yeah. I will say there are state laws also that would apply. And the last time I checked the Iowa Civil Rights Act, it was more expansive on what was allowed as a service animal. So there's a little bit of a conflict between state and federal law, but the federal law is dogs and miniature horses. So what the individual with a disability has to do in order to have a service animal is have that animal individually trained to do a task that relates to the disability. The most common that we see is guiding. So maybe an individual who is blind will have a guide dog. We've seen animals that pull the wheelchair, alerting someone who is having a seizure, reminding someone to take medication. And then we've seen a lot of service animals, usually through veterans programs, that are now dealing with PTSD, anxiety, different types of mental health disabilities where they are specifically trained to help calm that person down. And it's beyond just the typical good feelings that we all have with our own pets. I myself have cats. They know when I'm upset, but they're not trained specifically to react to some specific disability that I have.
So Cindy, does the ADA require like businesses have to allow like dogs who are snarling or you're barking at customers or using the restroom in their stores?
No. Nope. So on the next slide, you have to allow the service animal in all areas where a member of a public is allowed to go, but that animal must be under the control of the person. So no biting, no snarling, no defecating, no. Those animals are specifically trained to do something. So it cannot just be an individual walking in with their pet dog, and then that dog is reacting to different smells and different people. If it is a trained service animal and it's having a particular issue maybe with something that's going on in that space, the individual should probably remove themselves and the animal from the space. But no, it's not an absolute right that the dog or the miniature horse who's out of control has to stay in that space.
And unfortunately, that's a common theory I've heard from employers before about service animals.
If you are questioning whether somebody actually does have a service animal, there is only 2 inquiries that you are allowed to ask. And this is the most common complaint that we will get at Disability Rights Iowa, is where the Title III entity goes outside of these 2 questions and gets very specific or very rude with an individual with disability. But the 2 questions you are allowed to ask is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? The question is not, tell me what your disability is and reveal all your medical information. It is, does the dog or the miniature horse, is it required because of a disability? That is a yes or no question. And then you can ask, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? That should be easily answered by the individual who has a trained service animal. There is absolutely no requirement to have a certification or to carry some sort of license or document on the animal. And that is also another popular question that we will hear from someone who says the business is requesting that they produce some sort of documentation. The Department of Justice and the ADA folks at Congress did not require certification. So someone can individually train their animal to some task that's specific to their disability, and that is good enough.
Right, and any breed, obviously, there's no breed requirements of what kind of dog, would qualify as a service animal, provided it's trained appropriately.
Right. Now, as many times as we write letters to businesses informing them of what this law is and maybe where they went wrong with questioning the individual with disability, we also give advice to individuals with disability that they do or do not have service animals. I know that I have worked with a client who has a very cute little fluffy Pomeranian that goes everywhere with her in her arms, and she likes to dress it up in outfits and tutus and fun things, but the dog was never specifically trained to do anything with her disability. It's a comfort animal. And so we've also given advice the opposite way, that not every animal is a service animal. Okay, this might be more of a year in review than a new issue to anybody, but we just wanted to talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic and mask requirements in Title III entities, and why a business can make that request to have a mask requirement. This is just the law. This is not a political statement in any way. We're just informing you of where the ability to have that mask requirement comes from. And that is because coronavirus is a direct threat to health and safety of others. The CDC and all the other folks that are working on this have really clearly established that coronavirus is a direct threat to everyone's health. And that is why businesses can then set up a requirement that's related to that health and safety. And I put our little icon down in the bottom that says no shirt, no shoes, no mask, no service. We've been used to no shirt, no shoes for years. This is just another one of those requirements that is for the safety of the public. So anyone who gets exposed to COVID-19, we obviously know that we face a very meaningful risk, and that face masks have been used to counter that risk. And so those are the reasons why a business can require a mask requirement to enter their facility. Now, of course, if an individual with disability has some type of barrier to wearing a mask, and there are some of those conditions that doesn't allow an individual to have a mask, what does that business do? So some of the questions that we've got is, well, don't I have a constitutional right to refuse to wear a mask? The answer is no. You have a right not to wear a mask, but that doesn't mean that you have the right to enter into a business that has a mask policy. Another question is, well, if I'm an individual that proves that I have a disability and I cannot wear a mask, doesn't that mean that I just get to enter the business regardless? The answer is no. You're going to have to find an alternative way to get the services or the goods that you're seeking from that business. So you, the business owner, your responsibility is to make what we call a reasonable modification. So if you know an individual has a disability, they can't wear a mask in your facility, there are different things that you can do depending on what type of business you are. Retail, it's a little bit easier. We've kind of all experienced that. Curbside pickup or delivery, maybe ordering online. Some folks can actually do the face shield, but they just can't have like the cloth or the covering really close to their face. So allowing someone to wear a face shield would be a good accommodation. I wanted to talk about phone or online shopping. We're going to get into website accessibility here in just a slide or two. If you have a 24-hour website that allows someone to shop from home at any time, you really need to think about what's your availability. If that website's not accessible, do you also have 24-hour phone service? I'll get into that a little bit more, but again, I want everyone to think about equal access here. We've kind of talked about in another slide, a reasonable accommodation for folks is to have an employee shop for them. I've seen this in Hy-Vees and Targets and other places where I might have been I felt like it was myself and then all the employees pushing those carts around shopping for everybody that did the online shopping. So that's been a very popular issue. That is all I'm going to say about masks, but I would do a reminder that there are some folks where a mask becomes a barrier to effective communication. So perhaps someone who lip reads, that suddenly they're going to have trouble reading your lips if you're wearing a mask, and maybe have some communication barriers. So be a little flexible, talk to that individual about what's the best way to get around that. Some folks have gone to face masks that have the, like the plastic cutout. But there's been some interesting barriers that come up for people who want to comply with the mask mandates, but maybe have a communication barrier that they need to get around. All right, as to website accessibility or mobile apps, kiosks, those type of things, I am not a website accessibility expert. What I can tell you, though, is what the Americans with Disabilities Act required or doesn't require, and why this is important to try to make everything that you do electronically as accessible as possible. It's usually just it's a coding issue. So perhaps where maybe I don't have a type of disability that when I pull up a website, I don't see anything that would prohibit me with a disability from accessing the services, but someone with maybe a screen reader, someone who's blind, for instance, their screen reader is not doesn't have the capability to work that website. So when I wrote out a few different types of disabilities and some of the issues that people have, I wrote this more in a way of how do you know if your website is accessible? So if you're blind, if your website has screen reader capability, that's accessible. You need alternative text for images. For the pictures that I put into the slides today, you didn't see it when it came up, but if someone who is visually impaired is also listening to this, they would be able to read a description of the photos that I use. Audio descriptions. If you're a person with low vision, you might need to resize the text. So sometimes up in a corner of a website, you can make things large font, smaller font, color contrast. Again, for deaf or hard of hearing, you might need captioning for audio. Epilepsy needs no flashing content. And some of the examples for mobility is keyboard only access, or having an ability to turn off or slow down any of those time turnoffs. I'm always thinking of like Ticketmaster, when you go try to book a show or something, you have 5 minutes to accept the seats that they flash up to you. And if there's someone who's using some sort of pen or, some other kind of alternative assistive technology, that timed process may be too fast for them.
And nothing frustrates, our communities more than coming to us after the fact. So if you're not sure, please come as early on in the process as possible so that we can highlight red flags, as soon as they appear, of issues that are going to create, accessibility problems.
I did have a question come in real quick. It was about service animals. Sorry, if someone, like an employee of the office, is severely allergic to dogs, and someone comes in with obviously a service dog, how is that approached? How would you go about navigating that situation?
Well, allergies is usually the issue that comes up from somebody, and my response is the ADA outweighs someone with an allergy response. And we've seen that in education cases. We've seen it in public spaces like this. I think it's a harder sell for someone in a business or a small business setting to say that the allergic reaction is so strong when those connections with the consumer are short in time and space, versus maybe an employer where an individual asks their employer and says, I need to have a service animal with me all day long, and they're around other employees. But so in a Title III context or small business context, my opinion is that the ADA is going to trump that allergic reaction.
So thank you.
Manu, do you have anything different?
No, I just had a similar impulse, and it's absolutely a tricky situation, and sometimes these modifications policy and these accessibility challenges can kind of intersect in weird ways. And so just be willing to navigate those issues with sensitivity. And if you ever have a question, we're here as a resource to help you navigate those kinds of concerns.
I'm going into a hypothetical, which might be dangerous, but I can see a situation where an employee may have to remove themselves from a transaction and say, like, I've got to get someone else to assist you because this is going to cause me a reaction. The harder part is going to be, let's say there's only one person in the store. Like, if that person is unable to attend to the individual with disability, maybe that's where the rub is. I think just understanding that they have the legal right to have the service animal in the premise, versus saying, you need to get out of here, I'm about to have an allergic reaction. But if you just say, I'm going to have an allergic reaction, I need to come up with an alternative way to serve you, that's going to go over a lot better from a discrimination standpoint than just the pure rejection of the individual with the disability and their animal.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to quickly finish up websites, the Americans with Disabilities Act does not state what we call a specific legal standard. So the ADA doesn't say for website accessibility, you must use XYZ. So there was a group of experts that came up with what they call web content accessibility guidelines. And in all the cases that I've read and different exposures I've had to website accessibility problems, it seems that the WCAG is the standard that everyone's using as a best practice standard. So if you're familiar with that tech guidance, that's what I would say is what people are going to use as the standard in website accessibility. Again, I give a pitch: beware of who you hire. If you just Google website accessibility, there are a ton of for-profit companies that are going to come up to offer you services to make your website content accessible. Just make sure that they know what they're talking about before you enter into those contracts.
And engaging with the community directly is always a good practice. If you want to know the experiences of your place or somebody in a wheelchair, reach out to the community and say, hey, is there somebody who'd be willing to talk to me about how I can improve this experience? Because we're a resource that obviously we're invested in making your businesses as accessible as possible.
Yeah, and there's also ways to beta test, maybe with an individual who uses a screen reader and things like that. All right, we are near the end. So one of my last slides is, well, what happens if something goes wrong? How do you enforce the Title III of the ADA? If you're a private individual, you're going to be filing a lawsuit. And the remedies that are available under private lawsuit is what we call injunctive relief, or that's where a court is going to order the discrimination to be stopped. It's not what we call damages that go to an individual plaintiff, meaning you're not, we hear things on court TV and things like that about they were awarded $1 million in damages. That's not the type of remedy that's available under private lawsuits under Title III. It'll be some sort of order for you to do something, put in a ramp, or you are ordered to make your bathrooms accessible, those type of things. However, attorney's fees are awarded under Title III. So that's where the hit will be for a business if you have to pay an attorney who brought that lawsuit. The other thing you can do if there's a pattern or practice of discrimination in Title III entities, the Department of Justice or the Department of Transportation, whichever one attaches, has the right to come in and do their own complaint, their own investigation, and there are civil penalties and monetary damages that may be awarded under those. And I listened, I like to educate myself on these type of issues too. And someone reported that, here we go, a first violation penalty from the DOJ will cost you $96,384. If they find that you have any subsequent violations, the penalties immediately jump up to $192,000 and change. So they're pretty hefty.
And kind of stemming off of this, Samantha has a really good question of, do you think there is a business angle to specifically catering to people with disabilities? And if so, how would you market and show that your store or business is accessible? Like, how would you signify that to consumers? And I think there are a lot of answers to that question. One, we talk to each other and people with disabilities, we are a community. And so if some place is accessible and a great option for people with disabilities to go to, that information spreads really quickly. Additionally, the more information that you can put on your public facing websites and Google and Facebook, the better, to help us understand that you do have an accessible space or that you have accessible seating and you have all the things in place in order to be open for people with disabilities. And, at the end of the day, you want to make money, right? And people with disabilities, we have money to spend. We want to spend an irresponsible amount of it at your business. And it's really, I think, to everybody's benefit that we create these accessible features. And I know from some of the businesses we've worked with, Cindy, that people have got, business owners, when they've made accessible features, they've gotten tons of positive feedback from non-disabled customers, right?
Right. Accessible features actually helps not only the older Iowans, mothers with children who are pulling mega strollers. Being accessible is not, it's very helpful to the disability community, but it benefits everyone, to be honest with you, and makes all of our lives easier. I mean, all you have to do is twist your knee one time and have to go to physical therapy, and you will suddenly realize how many steps are involved in every place that we go.
Right. And just give us the reassurance that you understand these issues and that you've made, real attempts to comply with the requirements of the ADA. Mm-hmm. That's always really encouraging as a customer.
We put a few websites up where there's just really excellent information that you can get further about these issues and our contact information. Ben or Emmanuel, do you see any other questions?
No, I don't think so.
I had a few, but you have answered all of them, honestly. And so I wanted to give both of you a huge thank you and thank you to everyone in our audience. Cindy and Emmanuel, this has been awesome. You've shared such great information. Really appreciate the time both of you spent with us this afternoon, sharing your information. If there's any questions as we wrap up, feel free to leave those in the chat. But again, just wanted to thank both of you. Again, thank everybody in the audience and take a second to plug some of our upcoming programs. If you check out our website, we have 4 programs launching here in the next month or so that will be beneficial to business owners. Dream Builder, our 8-week course for anybody looking to get a business plan or figure out everything that's entailed with starting a business successfully. That kicks off next month, as well as Dream Maker, our course for existing business owners who are looking to find growth and stability in their business. We have Focus Me also kicking off in March, a group of entrepreneurs to do life coaching, accountability, and networking together. And then lastly, Financially Savvy, our multi-session course on everything small business, accounting, finance, and tax. So check some of those out on the website, and we'll be sending some information out after this webinar. So I'll get in touch with all of you. But again, huge thank you to Cindy and Emmanuel. Don't see any more questions. So with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Take care now.
Bye.